At the reading of the will, my son shouted in front of everyone, "If that shrew gets a share, I'll give up mine." I stayed silent and smiled. He didn't know the fortune was worth $11 million. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. The lawyer, Mr. Patterson, paused, his eyes darting nervously between Wesley and me. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. I could feel the weight of everyone's stares, my daughter-in-law Diane's smug expression, my sister-in-law Barbara's pitying glance, even my grandchildren's confused faces. My hands trembled slightly in my lap, but I kept my composure, the way I always had for the past 50 years. "Please continue, Mr. Patterson," I said quietly. Wesley scoffed, leaning back in his chair. At 47, my son had grown to look remarkably like his father Frank, tall, broad-shouldered, with that same confident set to his jaw. But where Frank's confidence had been earned through decades of hard work, Wesley's came from entitlement. "Mom, let's not pretend," Wesley said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Dad built this company from nothing. You were just along for the ride." Diane nodded in agreement, her manicured hand resting possessively on Wesley's arm. "Frank always said business decisions should stay with those who understand business," she added, not even bothering to look at me. I swallowed the familiar hurt, the same pain I'd been swallowing for years. At 72, I'd grown accustomed to being dismissed, overlooked, treated as if my only contribution to our family had been birthing Wesley and supporting Frank. They never saw the nights I spent reviewing contracts when Frank was too exhausted, the client relationships I nurtured while hosting countless dinners, the careful financial decisions I guided Frank toward when his ambition outpaced his judgment. Mr. Patterson cleared his throat. "This is just a preliminary meeting," he reminded. "Everyone, the formal reading will take place next week when the full documentation is prepared." "What's there to prepare?" Wesley demanded. "Dad left the business to me, the house to Mom for her lifetime, and the rest split between us. We all know that's what he planned." I caught Mr. Patterson's eye, and something in his expression made me sit a little straighter. Frank and I had spoken privately many times in his final months, as the cancer slowly took him from us. During those quiet conversations, when medication lowered his guard, my husband had confessed many regrets, particularly about Wesley. "I indulged him too much," Frank had whispered one night, his hand gripping mine with surprising strength. "I thought I was showing him love, but I just taught him to expect everything handed to him. He'll learn," I had reassured him, though I hadn't believed it myself. Frank's eyes had been clearer that night than they'd been in weeks. "No, Mabel, not unless something forces him to." Now, watching Wesley's entitled anger, I understood what Frank had meant. My son truly believed he deserved everything his father had built, without earning any of it. "The estate is more complex than you might think, Mr. Wesley," Mr. Patterson said carefully. "Your father made some significant changes in his final months." Wesley's head snapped up. "Changes? What changes?" I studied my folded hands, feeling a strange calm settle over me. Frank had never told me exactly what he'd planned, but he'd asked me to trust him one last time. "Wait and see, Mabel," he'd said, with that familiar twinkle in his eye that had first made me fall in love with him 50 years ago. "Just promise me you'll stand your ground when the time comes." "This is ridiculous," Wesley was saying now, standing up so abruptly his chair scraped loudly against the floor. "Whatever Dad did, I'll contest it if necessary. Mom has no head for business. She'd run the company into the ground in a month." "Wesley," I said softly, speaking up for the first time since his outburst. "Your father built Harrington Manufacturing. Over 45 years. Don't you think he had the right to decide what happened to it?" My son looked at me as if I'd suggested the earth was flat, and he decided to leave it to me, his son, his only child, the one who's worked beside him for 20 years. Not to his housewife who can barely operate a smartphone. The casual cruelty stung, but I didn't flinch. Behind Wesley's bravado, I could see something new in his eyes. Fear. He'd been counting on this inheritance, perhaps more than I realized. As everyone filed out of the room, Diane paused by my chair, leaning down as if to embrace me, her voice a poisonous whisper in my ear. "Don't get any ideas, Mabel. Wesley is prepared to fight for what's rightfully his." I patted her hand gently. "We all get what we deserve in the end, dear." When I was finally alone with Mr. Patterson, he looked at me with concerned eyes. "Are you all right, Mrs. Harrington?" I nodded, a strange lightness filling my chest. Frank knew exactly what he was doing, didn't he? Mr. Patterson's professional facade cracked into a small smile. "Your husband was a very wise man, and he adored you more than you probably realize." As I gathered my purse to leave, I thought about the fortune that Wesley had no idea existed. The $11 million Frank had quietly amassed beyond the company's value, and what my husband had decided to do with it. Next week would change everything. And for the first time in decades, I found myself looking forward to the future. The week between meetings stretched endlessly. I spent most of it alone in the house that Frank and I had shared for 43 years, running my fingers along the familiar surfaces, remembering. We'd bought this place when Wesley was 4, a modest 3-bedroom that seemed enormous after our starter apartment. Frank had just secured his first major contract, and I'd recently abandoned my teaching career to support his growing business. "Temporary," he'd promised as I packed away my education degree. "Just until things stabilize." But things never quite stabilized enough for me to return to teaching. Instead, I became Harrington Manufacturing's unseen foundation, managing our home, raising Wesley, hosting clients, reviewing contracts after hours, all while Frank became the company's public face. I paused at the mantel, picking up a photo from Wesley's college graduation. Frank stood proudly beside him, both in matching suits, their posture identically confident. I stood slightly apart, smiling, but somehow separate. Even then, I could see the pattern forming, though I'd been powerless to stop it. The doorbell rang, startling me from my memories. Barbara stood on the porch, clutching a casserole dish. "Thought you might need some company," my sister-in-law said, brushing past me into the kitchen. Unlike Frank, who'd been warm and gregarious, Barbara had always been brutally direct. "You look terrible, Mabel." I touched my uncombed hair self-consciously. "I haven't been sleeping well." Barbara set down her dish and faced me squarely. "Wesley's been calling me. Says Frank might have changed the will, might have left you more than your fair share." She made air quotes around the last words. "The reading isn't until tomorrow," I said carefully. "Cut the act, Mabel. Did Frank leave you the company?" I met her gaze steadily. "Frank and I didn't discuss the details of his will." Barbara snorted. "Right, 50 years together, and he never mentioned his plans for the multi-million-dollar company you helped him build." "Frank made his own decisions." She studied me for a long moment. "You know, I never understood you. You let Frank and Wesley walk all over you for decades. Even now, you're defending them." I turned away, busying myself with making tea. "You didn't live my life, Barbara." "No, thank God," she muttered. "I would have left Frank the first time he took credit for my work, which, from what I observed, was sometime around 1980. The kettle whistled, saving me from responding. As I poured hot water into mugs, Barbara continued, her voice softening. Slightly. "Do you remember when Wesley was about 12 and Frank got him that ridiculous racing bike?" I nodded, setting a mug in front of her. Wesley had begged for that bike for months, despite my concerns it was too advanced for him. "You told Frank it was dangerous. Frank bought it anyway. 3 weeks later, Wesley broke his arm." "That was a long time ago," I murmured. My point is, you were right. You were always right, Mabel. About Wesley, especially. You saw what Frank was creating with his indulgence. An entitled, spoiled man who never had to earn anything. I sank into a chair, suddenly exhausted. What do you want me to say, Barbara? That I failed as a mother? That I should have put my foot down more? Barbara reached across the table and gripped my hand, a rare gesture of affection from her. I want you to stop blaming yourself for Wesley's character. Frank made him what he is. Maybe you could have fought harder, but Frank would have just gone behind your back anyway. Tears pricked at my eyes. I did try, you know. When Wesley was in college, he got into trouble, drinking, failing classes. I wanted consequences. Frank just threw money at the problem, moved him to a different school. I remember, Barbara said grimly. And then Frank gave him a vice presidency straight out of college, despite him having 0 qualifications. I sighed, memories flooding back. Wesley's first year at the company, he lost a major client with his arrogance. Frank covered for him, told everyone it was a strategic decision. And now Wesley thinks he's entitled to run the company, Barbara concluded. He's worked there for 20 years, I pointed out. Worked? Barbara scoffed. He shows up late, leaves early, takes credit for his team's ideas, and spends more time on the golf course than in his office. Meanwhile, he and Diane are spending money like water. The new vacation house, the boat, private schools for the kids. I looked up sharply. How bad is it? Barbara hesitated. There are rumors, Mabel. Wesley's been leveraging his expected inheritance. They're in debt up to their eyeballs. This wasn't entirely surprising. Wesley and Diane had always lived beyond their means, and recently they'd been pressing Frank to formalize the succession plan, to put in writing what Wesley assumed was his birthright. Did Frank know? I asked quietly. Barbara nodded. Jim in accounting showed him some concerning transactions about 6 months ago. Wesley had been giving himself unauthorized bonuses, billing personal expenses to the company. 6 months ago, right around when Frank had started having those serious private conversations with me and Mr. Patterson. The timing suddenly made sense. After Barbara left, I went to Frank's study, a room I'd barely entered since his death. His presence was strongest here, in the leather chair worn to the shape of his body, the faint smell of his cologne still lingering. I ran my hand along his desk, remembering how many nights I'd brought him coffee as he worked late, how many times I'd given him my thoughts on a contract or a negotiation strategy. In the bottom drawer, I found a small leather journal I'd never seen before. Inside, in Frank's precise handwriting, was a letter addressed to me. My dearest Mabel, it began. If you're reading this, I've already gone, and you're wondering if you've spent your life being a doormat. The answer is yes and no. Yes, I took advantage of your generosity and brilliance too many times to count. No, it wasn't your fault. It was mine for being too proud to publicly acknowledge how much I needed you. The letter continued for pages. Frank's confession of how he'd realized too late the monster of entitlement he'd created in Wesley, how he'd watched our son manipulate and charm his way through life without developing any real substance. I can't undo the past, the letter concluded, but I can try to shape the future. Forgive me for the pain that's coming, but trust that it's necessary. Wesley needs to learn what you and I never taught him, that nothing valuable comes without earning. I'm trusting you to be stronger than I ever was. All my love, Frank. I closed the journal, my hands trembling. Tomorrow, I would discover exactly what Frank had planned, and why Wesley was so afraid. The morning before the final will reading, I decided to visit my grandchildren. Wesley and Diane had always controlled my access to them, scheduling our interactions, with the precision of international diplomats arranging peace talks. But today, I didn't call ahead. I simply drove to their sprawling Tudor-style home and rang the doorbell. The housekeeper, Maria, answered. her eyes widening at the sight of me. Mrs. Harrington, I didn't know you were coming today. Is Diane home? I asked, already knowing she would be at her weekly tennis lesson. No, ma'am, just the children. They're finishing breakfast. I smiled warmly. Perfect. I thought I'd surprise them. Maria hesitated, clearly uncertain whether to admit me without Diane's permission, but her respect for me as the family matriarch won out. She stepped aside. Emma and Jacob, 12 and 10, were sitting at the kitchen island, still in their pajamas despite it being nearly 10 o'clock. They looked up in surprise as I entered. Grandma? Emma said, her voice uncertain. Mom didn't say you were coming. It's a surprise visit, I explained, setting my purse down. I missed you both. Jacob, always the more affectionate of the two, slid off his stool and gave me a quick hug before retreating. Emma stayed where she was, watching me warily. Are your parents around? I asked casually, though I already knew the answer. Dad's at work, Jacob said. Mom's at tennis. I nodded, taking a seat at the island. How's school going? Emma shrugged. Fine. Did you finish that science project you were working on? The one about ecosystems? Emma's eyes widened slightly. You remember that? Of course I do, I said, gently. I remember everything you tell me. A flash of confusion crossed her face. But Mom said you don't really listen to us. That you're too distracted. My heart contracted painfully, but I kept my expression neutral. What else does your mom say about me? The children exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. You can tell me, I assured them. I won't be upset. Jacob bit his lip. She says you never really wanted Dad to be born, that you resented having to give up your job to raise him. The cruelty of the lie stole my breath for a moment. I had adored Wesley from the moment he was placed in my arms. Yes, I'd mourned my teaching career, but I'd never once regretted my son. And, Emma added hesitantly, she says you tried to convince Grandpa Frank not to let Dad work at the company because you were jealous of him. I closed my eyes briefly, steadying myself. Do you believe that? Both children looked down at their cereal bowls. It's okay, I said softly. These are complicated grown-up issues. But I want you to know that I have always loved your father very much, and I love both of you more than anything. I spent the next hour really talking with my grandchildren, perhaps, for the first time. Without Diane's hovering presence, they gradually relaxed, sharing stories about school and friends. I realized how little I actually knew about their lives, how successfully Diane had isolated them from me. As I was preparing to leave, not wanting to be there when Diane returned, Emma suddenly asked, Grandma, are you and Dad fighting about Grandpa's money? I paused, choosing my words carefully. Your grandfather worked very hard all his life. He wanted to make sure his money was used wisely. Dad says you're trying to take what belongs to him, Jacob said bluntly. A wave of sadness washed over me. Is that what he told you? Emma nodded solemnly. He was really upset. He said you never supported him like Grandpa did. I knelt down to their level, looking into their young, troubled faces. Sometimes adults disagree about important things, but that doesn't change how much we all love you. No matter what happens with Grandpa's will, you will always be my precious grandchildren. On the drive home, I could barely see through my tears. Diane hadn't just poisoned my relationship with my grandchildren, she'd rewritten our entire family history. In her version, I was the villain, the jealous mother who resented her own son's success. I pulled over, unable to continue driving. The pain was too sharp, too fresh. All these years I'd believed that Wesley's dismissive attitude toward me was simply the result of Frank's indulgence, of masculine pride. I never imagined he harbored such deep resentment, that he believed I had tried to hold him back. When I Finally arrived home, a familiar car was parked in my driveway. Thomas Reed, Frank's oldest friend and the company's financial controller, was waiting on my porch. "Thomas," I greeted him, wiping away the last traces of tears. "This is unexpected." His weathered face was grave. "We need to talk, Mabel, about Wesley." Inside, Thomas declined coffee, getting straight to the point. "Wesley's been borrowing against his inheritance, heavily." I nodded. "Barbara mentioned he and Diane have financial problems." "It's worse than that," Thomas said grimly. "He's leveraged everything on a real estate development in Colorado. Luxury ski condos. The project is failing spectacularly." "How bad?" "He's nearly $2 million in debt with nothing to show for it except half-built structures that won't pass code inspection." I sank into a chair. "Did Frank know?" Thomas nodded. "Frank discovered it about 7 months ago. Wesley had been embezzling from the company to cover his personal debts." "Embezzling?" The word felt like a physical blow. "Are you certain?" "I have the documentation." Frank confronted him privately. They worked out a repayment plan to avoid criminal charges. Frank was devastated. 7 months ago, when Frank's cancer had suddenly seemed to accelerate, when he'd started having those intense private conversations with me and Mr. Patterson. "Wesley's counting on his inheritance to bail him out," Thomas continued. "If he doesn't get what he's expecting." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Wesley wouldn't just lose face. He could lose everything. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. Thomas's expression softened. "Because Frank asked me to, after the will reading. He wanted you to understand what you're dealing with. Wesley isn't just entitled, Mabel. He's desperate." After Thomas left, I sat alone in my quiet living room, the weight of this new knowledge pressing down on me. My son, who had everything handed to him his entire life, had still wanted more. He'd stolen from his father, lied to his family, and now expected his inheritance to save him from the consequences of his actions. And tomorrow, at the will reading, he would discover whether Frank had thrown him a lifeline or cut him loose, to finally sink or swim on his own. The morning of the final will reading dawned bright and clear. I dressed carefully in a navy suit that Frank had always liked, my one concession to sentimentality. As I fastened my pearl earrings, Frank's gift, on our 40th anniversary, the doorbell rang. Mr. Patterson stood on my porch, his expression grave. "Mrs. Harrington, I thought we might ride together." I raised an eyebrow. "The reading isn't for 2 hours." "I know. I thought you might appreciate some preparation." I invited him in, a knot of anxiety forming in my stomach. "Is something wrong?" Once, seated in my living room, Mr. Patterson removed a thick folder from his briefcase. "Before we join the others, I need to explain Frank's plan in detail. He was very specific about the timing." "I'm listening," I said, folding my hands in my lap to keep them from trembling. "Frank came to me 8 months ago, shortly after his diagnosis. He was concerned about Wesley's fiscal responsibility." I nodded. "I've since learned about the embezzlement." Mr. Patterson looked relieved. "Good. That makes this easier." Frank was deeply troubled by Wesley's actions, not just the legal implications, but what they revealed about his character. He opened the folder, revealing a series of documents. Frank restructured his estate with 2 primary goals: protecting the company's future and providing you with security and control. "Control?" I repeated, the word unfamiliar in relation to my role in the family. "Yes." Frank recognized belatedly that you were always the more prudent decision-maker. He came to believe that Wesley's sense of entitlement stemmed from Frank's own actions, always giving Wesley what he wanted, never requiring him to earn his place. I felt a strange sense of validation hearing Frank's thoughts echoed by Mr. Patterson. For decades, I'd voiced these same concerns, only to be dismissed as overprotective or lacking business acumen. The will creates a trust, Mr. Patterson continued. All of Frank's assets, the company, the properties, the investments, will be held in this trust. You, Mabel, are the primary trustee. I stared at him. Me? Not Wesley? Not Wesley, he confirmed. Frank believed you would make decisions based on what's best for the family's long-term security, not just immediate gratification. My mind raced, trying to process this reversal of the roles I'd inhabited for 50 years. Wesley will contest it, I said finally. Frank anticipated that. Mr. Patterson's expression was grim, which is why he included some unusual provisions. He pulled out another document, this one marked with several highlighted sections. If Wesley contests the will, he forfeits everything. No exceptions. Everything? My voice was barely audible. Everything. His position at the company, his inheritance, even the house they live in, which is technically owned by Harrington Manufacturing. I stood up, suddenly needing to move. This seems extreme. Frank was protecting the company. And you, Mr. Patterson said. He knew Wesley would try to bully you into giving him control. This was his way of ensuring that couldn't happen. I paced to the window, gazing out at the garden Frank and I had tended together for decades. What about my grandchildren? Emma and Jacob shouldn't suffer for their father's mistakes. Frank thought of that too. Mr. Patterson pulled out yet another document. The trust includes provisions for their education and future security, regardless of Wesley's actions. Those funds cannot be accessed by Wesley or Diane under any circumstances. Relief flooded through me. Whatever happened, my grandchildren would be protected. There's more, Mr. Patterson said. About the 11 million. I turned back to face him. Yes? It's separate from the company assets. It's money Frank set aside over the years, investments that performed exceptionally well. Wesley doesn't know this money exists. I gathered that, I said. Frank mentioned it to me only once in passing. This money is yours outright, Mr. Patterson explained. No trust, no conditions. Frank wanted you to have resources that were completely independent of the company and Wesley. I sank back into my chair, overwhelmed. Why didn't Frank tell me any of this before he died? Mr. Patterson's expression softened. He said you might have tried to talk him out of it, that you'd spent a lifetime making excuses for Wesley, trying to keep the peace. That stung, partly because it was true. I had spent decades smoothing things over, making excuses, trying to protect the fragile